Frierdiker Rebbe, the journey into his Sfarim, his Neshama. The Frierdiker Rebbe assumed leadership from the Ben Yochid of the Rebbe Rashab, 1920, and that would span till 1950, till Tafshin Yud. The Frierdiker Rebbe's lifetime and his leadership, we all know, was not easy. It was marked by Mesiras Nefesh and by radical transitions. Whatever was happening in the Rebbe Rashab's times now came to fruition. 1920, the Bolshevik Revolution. And you can say it breaks into 3 decades, 3 stages, as the Rebbe explains. 1920 to 1930, Frierdiker Rebbe, most of those years was in Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks did everything possible to eradicate Judaism. And the Frierdiker Rebbe stood up to the point that he was arrested in 1927 and miraculously released, miraculously. But this would change radically the life of Jews in Russia. And Frierdiker Rebbe was forced to leave. He didn't want to. The next decade, 1930 to 1940, he was in Warsaw in Poland, in Riga, Latvia. And this was, of course, the time when Nazism was coming to the fore. Whatever Stalin was, Yamach Shema, the Nazis were far worse. Or maybe they're comparable. And this was the Frierdiker Rebbe dealing with those challenges. And then had to leave almost the last ship out of Riga to America, and coming in 1940 to America, the first half of that decade was, of course, the decimation of our Jewish people in Europe. We can only imagine what the Frierdiker Rebbe went through. And the second half, from 1945 after the war, was beginning to rebuild Judaism, with everybody saying it's impossible, especially in America. Frierdiker Rebbe saying America is not different. We're going to rebuild Judaism here. But it wasn't just a rebuilding, it was reinvigorating a demoralized people. You can imagine what the mood was like in 1945. But the Frierdiker Rebbe, in that resolute will of a Rebbe, armed the arsenal of Chassidus. All this time, from 1920 to 1950, never stopped saying or teaching and delivering Chassidus. You would think we're under the gun, running for our lives. No. He delivered Maimorim and he wrote Maimorim. He wrote most of his own discourses. Some were memorized by Menachem, Chezrim, and then written down, but most he wrote. It's even hard to imagine. How was he writing under the gun? In years that were really horrible years. But he did. Because he knew that Chassidus is the antidote to all these difficulties. And he knew better than anyone that within every darkness lies the greatest light. And he had that attitude. And that's what his Chassidus taught. I want to read a mimer. This is, mind you, written in 1933, delivered in 1933. Literally in the wake and the shadow of the fires that would consume Europe. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes, very abstract but very powerful statement. Mitziyuse gam shel haruchni, gam ken eine mitzadatzme. Context. We know nothing creates itself. Ein davar eisa esatzme, everything has a source. A building has an architect, a song has a composer, a book has an author. A world like ours has a creator. So nothing is mitzadatzme. Everything has a source. He's saying ruchnius too, not just physical matter, even sublime things, even ideas, even spiritual concepts, spiritual reality, spiritual realms, has a source. Ki'im mitzad hamoker, everything comes from its source. Aval kiyumei shel mitzias haruchni hu mitzadatzme. However, the value of a spiritual entity is it has its own inherent value. What does that mean? In the physical world, both its existence and its value is all from a source. It doesn't have anything of its own. In spiritual realm, its existence comes from a source, but its value does not. So the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, being that it's soul, it's sublime, and it doesn't have any substance of its own, therefore, that's its inherent value. Because the more you're mevatel it, and the Rebbe once said an expression, bittul kenish batel werden, you can destroy everything except something that's already self-effacing, selfless. Because the more you mevatel it, the stronger it becomes. So bittul, or ruchnius, because it recognizes its source, that itself gives it value. Gashmis does not recognize its source. See the far-reaching implications of that? The Rebbe has a footnote there, worth studying, very deep. He brings an example in Nigla, Machzis HaShekel. Not for now. But one has to wonder, why the Frierdiker Rebbe in these difficult times would say Maimorim like that? And perhaps we can say, because he, in seeing the evils that were emerging, which all come from the yesh of this world, the yeshus of this world, the darkness, that he felt it was important to go back into the engineering room and dissect the very engineering of what defines Gashmius in some way to weaken its hold. Obviously, what Nazi Europe did was not upheld by the Frierdiker Rebbe, meaning he did not stop it from happening. But still, he felt in some way he has to weaken its hold and give Ruchnius its real right. And when we look now, who prevailed, even though then it was so difficult, Chassidus prevailed, Torah prevailed. Now the Frierdiker Rebbe, in a similar way, interestingly, in the first discourse he ever delivered, his Maimer, that he wrote and said literally days after the Rebbe Rashab passed away, Reishis Goyim Amolek, the Rabbeim would say the same Maimer they began with Maimer, the last Maimer that the Rebbe before him said. The Rebbe Rashab's last Maimer was Reishis Goyim Amolek, Frierdiker Rebbe. And he talks here about a Rebbe. He says, Kedusha leizozim imkema. Holiness is permanent. It never leaves its place. Once it's there forever. Umokam ateirev ha'aveda shel tzaddik. The place where a tzaddik studied Torah and served God, the kol kelov, and all his utensils and all his furniture, if you wish, all his belongings, sheishtamish behem letzorchei aveda, that he used, meaning his table and his chairs and so on, kedushasei aleim, they always remain, the kedusha always remains, mechelke berure be'elam, because it's part of his mission to refine that part of the world. This is where the Rebbe says the expression that the Frierdiker Rebbe was 10 years in a location, 770. That location is forever changed. But then the Frierdiker Rebbe goes on and tells a story. He says, when I was 5 or 6 years old, around Tofresh Mem Heyor Memvov, I was in the room of Yechidus where my grandfather would have his personal library, his personal office. And my father, the Rebbe Rashab, after the Histalkus, the passing of the Rebbe Marash, came in, dressed with his gartel, stood at the table, his lips were whispering something, Ubocha harbe, and he cried tremendously. Essentially, that he saw with his own eyes how the Rebbe's table and chair and the Rebbe lives on. You can imagine why he would say that in the first Maimer, because that would empower him and the Chassidim with what we've been talking about, the theme of this evening. What better expression of Hey Tevis is this? That the words and the Torah lives on because the neshama of the Rebbe is invested, infused, inscribed in these words, and they live on. And the Frierdiker Rebbe felt it necessary to make that statement. In Tofshin Mem Zayin, Parsha Vayikra, the year when this of Hey Tevis, 33 years ago, a few months after the verdict came out of Hey Tevis, the Rebbe says a very powerful Sikha Vayikra Tofshin Mem Zayin, and speaks and cites this entire discourse, this section of it rather, about the Nitzchias of Nisim, that what they represent is forever, but it's in our hands because we make them live on. Mazari b'chaim, afu b'chaim. So the living lesson of this to all of us is very straightforward. It's the Hey Tevis lesson. The Rebbe once said in the Fabringen, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was here physically, he controlled his destiny. And now we control his destiny. Because when we learn this for him, and we live with them, and they become living example for how we should live, that brings the Rebbe alive. And I don't want to repeat the second half of it. So the lesson is very clear, especially on this special day. The Frierdiker Rebbe, of course, had his special nigunim, and one that stood out was called the Beinani. So now let us connect to the nigun, which, as I said, is kulmas halev. It's the quill of the soul that touches us in ways that words cannot.